Okay, let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive today into some of the most uh, complex and, frankly, most psychologically challenging parts of human personality.
We really are.
We're talking about psychopathy and pathological narcissism. And for most of us, these terms, they just conjure up images from movies, right?
Absolutely. Movie villains, maybe some high-profile true crime documentaries.
Exactly. The big, scary figures.
And that sensationalized kind of fear-driven image is exactly what we need to move past today. The sources we're digging into are, they're forensic, they're clinical, and often very dense.
Yeah.
They come from these incredibly detailed psychological interviews and a lot of research on addicted and correctional populations. Specifically, we have samples from Chile and Germany.
And that kind of data lets us see these profiles differently.
It does. It lets us see them not as these, monolithic supervillains, but as individuals whose minds are, well, they're structured in a fundamentally different way.
And that's really the mission for this deep dive. Our goal is precision. We want to move beyond those easy labels, like calling someone self-centered or just difficult.
Yeah, those labels don't really help.
We want to draw a sharp clinical line between someone who just has high confidence and someone whose mind fundamentally processes reality and human connection in a completely different way.
That's the key, the processing.
So we're going to define narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and psychopathy. And then, and this is the most crucial step, we're digging into the underlying structural psychological deficits.
Yeah.
The things that actually drive the behavior.
And to do that, we're relying on the globally recognized PCLR, that's the Hair Psychopathy Checklist revised.
Great.
But we're pairing it with a fascinating, much lesser known, but I think critical diagnostic tool.
Okay.
It's called the Operationalized Psychodynamic Diagnosis Structure Questionnaire, OPDSQ for short.
OPDSQ. And what does that combination let us do?
It lets us measure not just what they do, which is what most diagnoses focus on, but how the actual architecture of their personality is built, or in some cases, isn't.
The sheer amount of detail here, it suggests we can finally stop treating personality disorders as just these simple categories. We can start to understand the profound structural weaknesses that allow this kind of, well, this destructive behavior to thrive, whether that person is a family member, a colleague, or some figure in the news.
Exactly. It's about the why under the what.
So let's start at the surface. Because whether we're talking about a full-blown psychopath or a pathological narcissist, they often share a set of traits, and these traits make them incredibly effective at, well, at infiltrating relationships and even organizations. What are those surface characteristics, the sort of shared core that we see first?
Well, the superficial presentation is, it's highly similar. They often present this charming, really magnetic facade.
The charisma.
The charisma, yes. They are masters of manipulation, and they are pathologically deceptive. They lie constantly. And we're not talking about little white lies.
No.
It's often layering these massive fabrications on top of other lies, all without blinking an eye. And this is coupled with a very strong tendency toward what we call parasitism.
Parasitism. So they're basically feeding off of others.
In every sense. Yeah. They exploit the resources of other people, whether those resources are, emotional validation, attention, money, connections, whatever you have, they can use.
And they're incredibly adaptive, aren't they? They aren't static. It's not like you're dealing with the same person from one day to the next.
No, not at all. They are acutely astute and chameleonic. That's the best word for it. Yeah. They can adapt their personality instantly to suit whoever they're interacting with.
Why? What's the goal of that?
To gain approval, to gain control, or to get resources. This flexibility is a huge part of the charm. They become exactly who you need them to be in that moment. And crucially, they operate with this fierce sense of immunity. They seem to genuinely believe deep down that their actions won't have consequences.
Even when they're breaking the law.
Even when they're flagrantly breaking the law or any kind of moral code, there's this belief that they're just above it all.
That sense of immunity just fascinates me. It suggests a complete failure in internalizing responsibility. It's not that they, forget they did something wrong.
No, not at all.
It's that the concept of personal accountability, it just doesn't register. It's not a brake on their future behavior.
Exactly. It doesn't compute in the same way. But this is the point where we really need to start differentiating. We have to be careful not to conflate general, highly confident personality traits with severe pathology.
Right. Not every confident person is a narcissist.
Of course not. And that leads us directly to the distinction between narcissism as a trait versus narcissistic personality disorder.
So narcissism itself, it's just like any other personality attribute. It exists on a spectrum.
Precisely. Being narcissistic is a personality trait, much like being proud or ambitious or pessimistic. It's a spectrum that runs from healthy self-esteem all the way to a total preoccupation with the self.
And where does it cross the line into a disorder?
It only becomes a pathological personality disorder, so narcissistic personality disorder, when that trait is so exaggerated that the person is profoundly egocentric. They prioritize themselves above everything else.
Everything and everyone.
Everything and everyone.
And the resulting damage when they hurt people.
When a pathological narcissist causes harm, it's usually incidental. It's often just a consequence of this extreme total self-prioritization. It's not always the primary goal.
So they're not necessarily setting out to cause pain.
Not always. They are seeking glorification, admiration, validation. They want to be the best, the most powerful. The harm they inflict on other people is generally collateral damage in their relentless pursuit of self-fulfillment. You got in the way of their need for supply.
Okay, that makes sense. If the narcissist harms you because you were collateral damage, then the psychopath is different. They might view you as a tool, or worse, just some abstract obstacle.
Yes, and this brings us to the most critical distinction of all, the empathy gap.
The empathy gap. This is everything.
It is everything. What's so fascinating here, and what all the research confirms, is the nature of their awareness. They are not delusional. They are cognitively connected to reality.
They know what's real.
They know it's real. They can differentiate perfectly well between good and evil. They understand the rules of society.
So when people ask that question, do they know what you're doing is wrong? The answer is yes, at least on a rational, intellectual level.
Absolutely, yes. They possess what we call cognitive empathy.
Cognitive empathy.
This means they know what other people expect of them in any given social situation. If you are sharing a deeply sad story, they know the social script. They know it requires them to look concerned, to maintain eye contact, offer comforting words.
They can perfectly predict your emotional response to what they do.
Perfectly. They are hyper-aware of your vulnerabilities and your emotional needs, which of course is what makes them such effective manipulators. They know exactly which buttons to push.
Okay, but here's the deficit. Here's the gap.
But here is the critical structural deficit. They do not possess emotional empathy. They do not feel what other people are experiencing. The connection is made entirely with the head, with rational analysis, not with the heart.
So when you cry in front of them,
they see tears. They recognize the visual cues, the auditory cues of distress, but they feel no corresponding internal distress themselves, no visceral sense of, moral obligation to respond genuinely.
And this deficit is so profound that the source material uses this very specific psychological language to describe it. Let's talk about it.
Poca profundidad en los afectos.
Es poca profundidad en los afectos. It literally translates to little depth in affections.
Little depth.
It means that while they might experience fleeting emotions like anger or frustration,
Flash-in-the-pan emotions. Exactly. Their emotional life is profoundly shallow. The sustained, complex, bonding emotions, love, deep remorse, lasting guilt, genuine concern, those are largely absent, or at least very superficial. They can't sustain a true emotional connection.
and that ties directly into another concept from the sources, the concept of huela. You mentioned earlier that when we experience something painful or morally significant, it leaves an emotional imprint on us, a huela. What does that mean for regulating their future behavior?
Well, for a psychologically healthy individual, a painful or shameful memory leaves an emotional footprint. That's the huela. This lingering trace of distress is what regulates our future behavior.
Okay.
If I hurt you once, the memory of your pain and my associated guilt or shame, it leaves an emotional trace that prevents me from doing it again. It acts as a guide.
Right. I remember how bad that felt, so I won't do it again.
Precisely. For the psychopath, because they never experienced the genuine emotional impact in the first place, the action leaves no meaningful huela. They cognitively understand the consequence, I got punished, I went to jail, but they don't carry the emotional weight of the action itself.
I think the sources provide a really powerful way to frame their motivation based on this gap. Their actions aren't driven by some cinematic desire for sheer cruelty. It's not for the fun of it. It's strictly functional.
That's the key takeaway. Their motivation is cold, it's clinical, and it's goal-oriented. The internal monologue is stripped down to its basics.
Does it sound like?
Something like, I want to achieve X, and for that I must do Y. I know Y isn't ethical, and I know Y will hurt other people, but I don't care, because the pain of others doesn't register as a barrier to my goal.
So for them, the end justifies the means entirely.
Entirely. Because the pain of others is just. It's irrelevant to their calculation. It's a non-factor.
Let's use the stark example provided in the source about infidelity. I think that really illustrates this lack of huella.
It's a perfect example. If they're unfaithful to their partner, they enjoy the experience. They get the excitement, the novelty, the immediate gratification.
And the partner's suffering.
It's disregarded entirely in the moment. When they get confronted, they are perfectly capable of feigning repentance. They can express remorse that sounds completely convincing.
They can act out the social script of an apology.
Flawlessly. However, they demonstrate its lack of authenticity the moment they repeat the behavior. And they will.
Because the action itself and the pain it caused, it left no lasting emotional scar on them.
Exactly. They never felt the emotional impact to begin with, so there's no huella. The behavior persists because the cognitive understanding of right and wrong is completely divorced from the effective emotional response.
Which just underscores how difficult intervention must be. You can try to teach them that if they behave badly, they'll go to jail or they'll lose their job.
Consequence and punishment. You're hitting the behavioral side.
Right. But you can never make them understand they have to stop because they generate pain in another person.
Yeah.
You can only regulate the consequence, not the core defect.
That's it. You're trying to teach a colorblind person the moral significance of the color red. They can understand the word red and they can learn its consequences. Red means stop. But they cannot experience the sensation of red. You're teaching them external rules, but you're not fixing the core deficiency in their effective wiring.
Okay, so to understand these deficits operationally, how we actually measure them, we have to look at the diagnostic frameworks. And we have to begin with the gold standard for measuring psychopathy. The Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised, the PCLR.
The PCLR is globally validated and highly, highly reliable, especially in forensic and correctional settings. And it organizes psychopathic traits into 4 facets, which then map onto 2 major factors.
And this structure is what's so important, right?
It's critical. It allows researchers to isolate the core personality elements, which we call Factor 1, from the merely antisocial behaviors, which are Factor 2.
Okay, so let's break down Factor 1 first. Interpersonal and affectivity. This is the core personality of the psychopath, the part that requires deep clinical inference, because you can't always see it in, say, a police report.
Right. This isn't about counting arrests. Factor 1 is comprised of the personality traits that fundamentally define the lack of human connection and the predatory style. It breaks into 2 facets.
Okay.
First, you have facet 1, the interpersonal aspect. This covers the superficial stuff. Their loquacity and superficial charm, their grandiosity and egocentrism, their pathological lying, and their controlling and manipulative nature.
So this is the mask, the charming storyteller who thinks they're better than everyone.
Exactly. They project this overwhelming confidence and believe they're entitled to special treatment. Then you have facet 2, the affectivity. This is the emotional emptiness underneath the mask.
So this is the scary part.
This is the core deficit. Lack of guilt and remorse, shallow affect, that poca profundidad en los afectos we talked about, that low emotional depth cruelty and lack of empathy, and a profound failure to accept responsibility for their actions.
That last point feels so key. Nothing is ever their fault.
Nothing. There's always an excuse, always someone else to blame.
So Factor 1 describes who they are, the charming mask and the emotionally empty core beneath it. Factor 2, then, is about what they do. It's their history of behavior.
Yes. Factor 2 is lifestyle and antisociality. And these items are much more observable, objective behavioral indicators. You can often draw them directly from criminal records and personal history.
So what's in Factor 2?
It also breaks into 2 facets. Facet 3 is lifestyle. This describes their unstable and exploitative approach to life.
Okay.
You see a constant tendency toward boredom and a need for excitement. They get habituated to things very easily and they seek risk. You see impulsivity, pervasive irresponsibility, a parasitic lifestyle where they literally live off the backs of others, and a lack of realistic long-term goals.
They live purely in the moment.
Purely. And then facet 4 is antisociality. This is the overt criminal and conduct history.
The rap sheet.
The rap sheet, basically. Poor behavioral control, early conduct problems. usually starting before age 15, juvenile delinquency, revocation of benefits, so things like probation or parole violations,
Mm-hmm.
and criminal versatility,
Mm-hmm.
which means they commit many different types of crime rather than just specializing in one.
That distinction is incredibly helpful. Factor 1 is the internal structure or lack thereof. Factor 2 is the external manifestation of that.
And remember, the total PCLR score ranges from 0 to 40. The cutoffs vary a bit. It's often 30 in North America, maybe 25 in Europe. But the goal is to see where the individual sits on this continuum of severity.
Okay, now here's where it gets really, really interesting for me. The complex, and you call it asymmetrical, relationship between psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, or TAP.
Yes.
Now, TK is the official DSM diagnosis, and so many people use these terms interchangeably. But the data, particularly in your sources, proves they are not synonymous at all.
They are not. And that is probably the greatest diagnostic challenge the field faces right now. The sources make a very sharp empirical distinction. TAP, according to the DSM, is defined almost exclusively by behavioral criteria.
Just the factor 2 stuff.
Mostly. To get the diagnosis, a patient has to show a pervasive pattern of disregard for the rights of others. That includes a history of conduct disorder before age 15, repeated arrests, irresponsibility, physical aggression.
So if you look at that definition, that list of criteria for TAP, it maps almost perfectly onto factor 2, the lifestyle and antisociality of the PCLR.
Exactly. The core affective elements of psychopathy, that's factor 1, the lack of empathy, guilt, and remorse, they're either secondary or entirely excluded from the official criteria for antisocial personality disorder.
Wow.
This is the critical diagnostic divergence that the PCLR was designed to correct.
The implication of that is just staggering. The research shows that diagnosing someone with high-level psychopathy using the PCLR was highly predictive of them also getting a TAP diagnosis. It was an overwhelming 98.6% overlap in one sample. But the reverse was dramatically different. So if you're a psychopath, you're almost certainly antisocial. But if you're antisocial, you're probably not a psychopath.
That's the key finding. Only a small percentage of individuals diagnosed with TAP-IT. It ranges from about 18% to 30% in the studies. Also met that high threshold for psychopathy.
So if nearly 70% of antisocial offenders aren't psychopaths, does that suggest the PCLR is too strict for therapeutic settings?
Mm-hmm.
Or does it mean we're dramatically underestimating the sheer diversity of factor 2 criminality?
I think it's just the latter. It means TAP is a much broader, less severe, and largely behavioral classification. It's a big umbrella.
Okay.
It describes a wide variety of criminals and troubled individuals whose issues might stem from, environmental factors, substance abuse, other personality disorders, all sorts of things.
But psychopathy?
But psychopathy, as measured by the PCLR, is the most severe, the most narrow classification. And it's defined by that deep, pervasive, affective deficit factor 1 combined with the persistent antisocial history of factor 2.
In essence, TAP tells you that the person acts badly.
Yes.
The PCLR tells you that the person is structured badly, with an inability to form the emotional bonds that would govern that behavior.
You've hit the nail on the head. If you only look at behavior, you miss the profound structural personality failure at the core of true psychopathy, which is why we now have to turn to the OPDSQ.
Okay, so we've established that these descriptive diagnoses, they're insufficient, especially if our goal is effective intervention. We can't just look at the what, we need the why.
Exactly. We need to infer these substructural processes, the dynamic ways they regulate their emotions, how they relate to others, how they perceive reality.
And this is where that new tool comes in, the subsurface analysis tool, the Operationalized Psychodynamic Diagnosis Structure Questionnaire, the OPDSQ.
The OPDSQ provides a map of the internal architecture. When we talk about structure in psychology, we mean how the self is organized, how resilient it is, how integrated, how flexible the basic functions of the mind are.
So it's not about behavior, it's about the foundation.
It is. These structural aspects underlie everything: conduct, relationships, affectivity. They involve processes that are often unconscious and can't be directly observed. You have to infer them through careful questioning.
So this is kind of like mapping the internal software of the mind. How intact are the basic functions that allow a person to be a regulated individual, both in relation to themselves and with the world?
That is a perfect analogy. And the OPDSQ assesses the level of structural integration of the personality across 4 dimensions, and this is crucial. Each of those dimensions is oriented toward the self and toward others.
Okay.
In psychological terms, we call the other the object. And one really important thing to remember, A higher score on the OPDSQ means a lower level of structural integration.
So high score is bad. It means more vulnerability, more deficit.
Exactly.
Let's break down those dimensions briefly, just so we can grasp what they're measuring internally.
Sure. The first is cognitive capacity. That's the ability to perceive oneself and others realistically, and the capacity for self-reflection.
Can you see yourself clearly?
And others clearly. The second is capacity for regulation or management. This is the ability to manage your internal states, your affects, your impulses. This is where autoregulation or self-regulation falls.
Your internal brakes.
Your brakes, yes. The third is capacity for communication, the ability to communicate your internal experiences and emotions effectively to others. And the fourth is relational capacity.
How you connect.
How you connect, the ability to engage in stable, reciprocal relationships, and the capacity for attachment. And this is where that critical function, regulation with the object, falls.
And when we compare these structural scores from the OPDSQ to the psychopathy scores from the PCLR in these inmate samples, the connection becomes immediately clear.
It does. The findings absolutely confirm the structural weakness that underlies psychopathy. The total PCLR score correlates significantly with the total OPDSQ score.
So, in plain English,
More psychopathic traits and behaviors equals poorer structural integration. It means more fundamental vulnerabilities in the personality's basic architecture.
and what were the most predictive structural weaknesses? Which areas of the self's internal functioning correlated most strongly with high psychopathy scores?
The most potent association by far was found with the subscale known as regulation with the object. The correlation was R equals 0.55.
0.55, that's a strong correlation in this kind of research.
It's very strong. And it tells us exactly where the fracture is most severe. This structural function, it relates to the individual's ability to protect their interpersonal relationships from their own impulses,
All right.
to consider the interests of others alongside their own, and most critically, to regulate their behavior based on the actual reactions of the people around them.
When you say they struggle to differentiate self from other, are we talking about the psychological concept of ego boundaries? Does this mean that the psychopath views other people as, like, extensions of their own needs?
That's an excellent way to frame it.
Which would make the idea of regulating against that need functionally impossible.
It is. The boundary between the self and the other is either permeable or it's non-existent when it comes to regulating impulses. If that function regulation with the object is failing at a structural level, it means the victim's reaction, their pain, their disapproval. It literally holds no governing power over the psychopath's behavior.
So the source material says they have major difficulties protecting relationships from their own impulses.
They do. If I feel like doing something, the fact that it will ruin your life is not a structural barrier to my action. It doesn't even enter the equation in a meaningful way.
Okay, let's translate that 0.55 correlation into something actionable, something relatable for the listener who's not in a forensic setting. What does a structural failure in regulation with the object actually look like in everyday life?
Well, it manifests in a few primary relationship failures. First, I would say financial exploitation and boundary violation. This isn't just borrowing money and forgetting to pay it back. It's the partner who takes out loans in your name or steals your savings. And when you confront them, their response is either blank confusion or outrage that you are making a fuss about it.
Because the damage to you isn't real to them.
Exactly. The structural failure prevents them from internalizing the damage they caused to your financial security as a valid reason to stop the exploitation.
Okay, what's the second one?
The chronic disregard for time and schedule. Now, this sounds trivial, but it's a symptom.
Right.
It's the colleague who consistently misses deadlines or fails to show up on time because their immediate personal desire, like sleeping and or stopping for a coffee, took precedence.
And when you point out the consequences for the team.
They lack genuine remorse. They might apologize, but they don't get it. They cannot internalize the fact that their actions inconvenienced you or risked the team's project. They regulate their behavior based only on their own internal state.
And a third example, which I think ties back to that infidelity example.
Yes, emotional triangulation and disregard. It's the family member who creates endless drama, pitting one person against another. And when the relationship inevitably collapses because of their lies, they blame the conflict entirely on external factors or on the emotional instability of the victim.
That's too sensitive.
Exactly. Their internal software cannot compute that their manipulation caused the damage because the object, the relationship itself, is secondary to their own need for stimulation or control.
So that's the main one.
Oh,
But there was another predictive structural weakness you mentioned.
Yes, we shouldn't overlook it. Autoregulation, or self-regulation, also had a significant correlation at R equals 0.34.
Still meaningful.
Very. This means they have less available internal functions to integrate, regulate, and direct their own impulses and effects adaptively. And this gives us the clinical grounding for their observed factor 2 traits, the impulsivity, the need for excitement, the poor behavioral control.
So the engine of the self is just running without reliable brakes.
That's a great way to put it.
This research also showed the heterogeneity of the criminal population. It's not like everyone who commits crimes is driven by this same structure. The study divided the sample into 3 statistically distinct groups based on this interaction between the PCLR scores and the OPDSQ structural scores.
Yes, this cluster analysis is vital.
Why is it so important?
Because it moves us beyond simple labels. It shows us that even among a population of people who all commit crimes and have substance abuse issues, there are fundamentally different types of internal wiring at play.
Okay, let's start with cluster 1, psychopaths. This was the high pathology group. Their overall PCLR scores averaged 27.80, which firmly places them in the high range of psychopathy.
And they scored high on both factor 1, the affective core, and factor 2, the antisocial lifestyle.
So they have the personality deficit and the behavioral history.
They have it all. This group had high scores across all 4 facets. They were the most aggressive and pervasive offenders, and there was a striking detail from the data. 100% of this group showed the presence of need for excitement, boredom, tendency, and poor behavioral control.
Every single one of them. And structurally, as you'd expect, they were the most damaged.
They were. They presented the worst structural functioning. They demonstrated significantly worse structural integration, so the highest OPDSQ scores, than all the other groups in every single key area. Perception of object, autoregulation, object regulation, and the total OPD score. They're the definition of structural failure.
And diagnostically, they were highly pathological and highly violent. They have the highest prevalence of TT, antisocial personality disorder, at 64.29%. And they were the only cluster that committed homicide at 21.43%.
Robbery was also highly prevalent with them.
But there's a paradox here we have to discuss. They also had the highest prevalence of anxiety disorder at 35.71%. Now, why would the most pathologically severe group, defined by a lack of emotional depth, also be the most anxious? That seems like a contradiction.
It does, and that contradiction is critical. It really speaks to the concept of secondary psychopathy. The anxiety they're experiencing likely isn't existential dread or remorse over what they've done.
Yeah.
It is probable anxiety that's derived from their high factor 2 lifestyle. They're impulsive, they're criminally versatile, they have poor behavioral control. That kind of chaotic, reckless life leads to high external stress.
Of course.
The constant threat of being caught, of being arrested, of being injured by rival groups, their anxiety is likely about consequence, the factor 2 stuff, not about guilt, which is factor 1. They fear losing control of their environment, not the moral outcome of their actions.
That reframes the anxiety beautifully. It's operational anxiety, not affective anxiety. Okay, now let's look at cluster 2. Criminals with psychopathic traits. Their PCLR average was moderate, at 21.32.
This group is fascinating because they showed high scores on the core personality traits. That's factor 1, the interpersonal affectivity, much like cluster 1 did. So the emotional deficit is present.
What?
But they had only moderate scores on factor 2, the antisocial lifestyle. Behaviorally, they were less defined by criminal versatility and chaos than the cluster 1 psychopaths.
And their internal structure, measured by the OPDSQ, was significantly healthier than cluster 1.
Yes, they presented significantly more available structural functions. So they had lower, better OPD scores compared to cluster 1. This suggests that while they possess the affective defects, their internal self-management is more intact, which prevents that total life derailment we see in cluster 1.
And this structural difference seems to correlate with a very different crime profile.
Absolutely. This group had zero diagnosis of anxiety disorder, which supports that idea that the chaos of high factor 2 is what drives that anxiety. And crucially, they had a very high prevalence of sexual offenses, 57.14%, and very low robbery rates. This profile, high factor 1, moderate factor 2, and a relatively more intact structure might align more closely with what's sometimes called primary psychopathy.
And what does that mean?
It's where the emotional coldness is the dominant feature, leading to more calculating, often nonviolent but deeply exploitative crimes like sexual offenses or high-level fraud, rather than generalized street crime and violence.
So the difference between cluster 1 and cluster 2 is where the PCLR data meets that OPDSQ structural data. It's the combination of the affective failure, factor 1, and the behavioral failure, factor 2, that results in the deepest structural damage we see in cluster 1.
Precisely. Factor 1 is the internal failure to bond with others. Factor 2 is the failure to control your behavior in the world. When both of those are maximally present, the personality structure just collapses entirely.
And finally, we have cluster 3, non-psychopathic offenders. They have the lowest PCLR scores, averaging just 10.13. They are not psychopaths.
This is the large group of offenders who are driven by factors other than that core psychopathic personality. Things like substance abuse, poverty, trauma, or other less severe personality disorders.
And structurally.
They function similarly, structurally, to cluster 2, meaning their internal architecture is more intact than cluster 1. They had low rates of TAP and low rates of anxiety disorder. Their path to criminality it's environmental or situational, not structural, in this deep, pervasive way.
The structural data is where we find the truth. It moves the discussion away from just observing bad behavior and focuses it on the internal fragility, that failure of regulation with the object that makes that behavior inevitable for the most severe individuals.
That's the core of it.
So let's really dig into the implications of these structural findings. We've said that the psychopaths in cluster 1 are defined by the absolute worst structural deficits. How does this deep-seated failure to manage the self and object relationships, how does that translate into their fundamental inability to function within society?
It means they have a pervasive difficulty differentiating self from other. When that boundary is confused or broken, it leads directly to the breakdown in autoregulation or self-regulation, and most critically, regulation con el objeto, regulation in relation to others.
And that provides the psychological underpinning for everything we see.
It does. For their egocentrism, their lack of empathy, their manipulation, in their internal world, your suffering is merely an abstract obstacle to their fulfillment. They cannot internalize the needs of others as a governing principle for their own actions.
So it's not just a moral failing, it's an architectural failure of the mind. That inability to regulate behavior based on the actual reactions of others is a direct failure of that primary structural function, the regulation with the object.
And this has profound clinical implications. As the research shows, they present major difficulties for protecting relationships from their own impulses and for considering others' interests. This is why interventions focus purely on moral education or empathy training they fail.
Because you can't train a structure that doesn't exist.
Exactly. You would have to try and stabilize the structure first, which is an extremely difficult, if not impossible, task.
Let's focus again on that contrast between the clusters. Cluster 2 had high affective deficits, that's factor 1, but they had a better structure than cluster 1 because their factor 2 was only moderate. This seems crucial for any kind of intervention.
Yes. This distinction highlights that while the core emotional defect of factor 1 makes someone potentially predatory, it is the addition of high behavioral chaos factor 2, the chronic lying, the impulsivity, the parasitic lifestyle that pushes the structural integrity to the breaking point.
Resulting in cluster 1.
For cluster 2, perhaps there's a greater capacity for maintaining that structure and controlling their behavior, which makes them less prone to the external chaos and legal trouble, even though the affective core is still cold. They are simply better at hiding the deficit.
But then, conversely, the structural similarity between cluster 2 and cluster 3 is interesting if their internal architecture is similar, more intact than cluster 1. Why are their factor 1, their affective scores, so dramatically different?
That's a powerful question. And it opens the door to environmental influences. Cluster 3, the non-psychopathic offenders, they have a healthy structure, but they may have been driven to crime by necessity or addiction or specific situational trauma.
Right.
Cluster 2 has that similar structural capacity, but they also possess the factor 1 affective coldness. This suggests that structure is a prerequisite for behavioral control, but the affective failure is an independent variable.
So you can have a stable structure and be cold-hearted, like cluster 2.
Or you can have a stable structure and be driven by circumstance, like cluster 3. But if you have the affective coldness and the behavioral chaos, your structure fails. And that's cluster 1.
Let's pivot now. Let's talk about the human cost and the experience of the victims. For people who are entangled with these profiles, how do they sense the danger? The research suggests it's not a rational fear, but a somatic intelligence at play.
The sources describe it as a corporal reaction, an unconscious perception where the body responds negatively to that specific person or their interactions.
A gut feeling.
More than that, it's an intuition that bypasses rational thought. It's a somatic alarm system that's signaling non-congruence. Your body recognizes that the person's charming facade doesn't match the structural reality of their mind long before your conscious brain processes all the red flags.
Your body recognizes that the person speaking to you doesn't have the necessary self-other boundary to keep you safe.
That's a great way to put it.
That's an incredible insight. But how does a listener know if that intuition has a real foundation or if it's just, say, residual trauma or general anxiety being projected onto a new relationship?
You need to observe the context. If this pervasive uneasy feeling, this corporal reaction, the tightness in your chest, the feeling in the pit of your stomach, if it occurs only with one person, that specific colleague, that partner, that family member, and not generally with everyone you meet, then your intuition has a clinical foundation. It should be trusted.
And if it's with everyone?
If everyone makes you feel fearful or anxious, then the work is likely internal based on past experience. But if it's isolated to that one manipulative, charming person in your life, your body is seeing the structural failure where your mind is still processing the charm.
And finally, for those who might want to help a victim escape a relationship with a psychopath or a pathological narcissist, the research advises extreme caution and delicacy. We can't overstate the importance of this.
No, we can't. The helper must be extremely careful because the victim is often deeply invested. They may not be ready to sustain the pain of realizing the total reality of their relationship.
The relationship, even a toxic one, is often a major organizing principle of their life.
It is. And to expose the pathology too early before they are psychologically ready can be devastating. It can send them rushing back to the abuser for reassurance, or it can cause a total emotional collapse.
So you can't just shake them away. The realization has to be organic.
The most constructive approach is silent, non-invasive support. Maintaining affection, maintaining respect for the victim's timeline, and providing a stable, non-judgmental presence. Those are the goals.
You become the reality check they can safely land on.
Exactly. Unless, of course, the victim's life is in immediate physical danger. That is the sole exception where intervention has to be immediate and decisive.
Of course.
Otherwise, the helper's role is simply to ensure they have the resources, the financial independence, and the emotional safety net available for when they reach that point of structural realization themselves.
This deep dive has been incredibly clarifying. We've moved from the sensationalized villain to the specific, measurable, structural components of personality failure using this international forensic research.
We have. We've established that psychopathy involves a critical deficit in emotional empathy, that lack of huela, which is why it's so distinct from mere antisocial personality disorder, or TP. And psychopathy, particularly in its most chaotic form, that cluster 1 is structurally characterized by the deepest vulnerabilities in managing the self, and most critically, managing the self in relation to others.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that function of regulation with the object proved to be one of the strongest statistical indicators of psychopathic severity across this international forensic sample. This is more than just a data point. It shows us where the core humanity is missing.
It does, and it suggests that our current interventions, which are often focused purely on reducing criminal behavior, so targeting factor 2, they may fail unless they can somehow address this fundamental structural deficit. The inability to internalize the needs of others and allow their reactions to legitimately govern one's own behavior. For the true psychopath, every relationship is a potential target because the architecture to maintain and protect that relationship is it's fractured.
This raises an important question for you to think about. If regulation with the object is the key indicator of this deep structural failure, think about this. What is the smallest, most casual boundary disregard you see every day that might be a structural failure in its nascent form?